Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Poole, and my guest today is Joshua Frank, who's the editor of Counterpunch, and he has also written a book called Atomic Days, and it's about a site and on the West Coast. So, Josh, you take over, explain, about the book and why you wrote it.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's good to be back. Um, I About 10 years ago, I was doing some investigative work for Seattle Weekly, and I knew about a site that's in eastern Washington state called Hanford. And Hanford was chosen as one of the three main sites for the Manhattan Project to produce components, parts, and in this case, fuel for our atomic weapons. So I knew about this site. I knew its history a little bit, but I didn't know a lot about what was going on out there. And I got in touch with a union lawyer who had sent me a bunch of documents. Those documents were the first time they had ever been seen by a journalist. And they detailed some pretty nefarious stuff that was going on out there and a couple whistleblowers that were going on record. Fast forward, I wrote a couple pieces for Seattle Weekly on those whistleblowers and their stories. And it caused a little bit of a stir at the time, and then it kind of just subsided. But in that course of research for those 2 years that I was working on those pieces, I realized that most people hadn't heard about Hanford and didn't know what was going on out there. And so I approached the publisher about this book project, and they were excited about it. And so I've included in this book, Atomic Days, the stories that were in those Seattle Weekly pieces, are portions of them to talk about those whistleblowers, but then also just talk about the bigger story about what Hanford was, and will one day hopefully be. And then also all of the issues surrounding that, the dangers that are out there and those sorts of things. So just for your listeners, just to give them a brief overview of what Hanford was and is. Hanford was chosen, as I mentioned, for the Manhattan Project, and over about 40 years, it produced plutonium that ended up being used in the nuclear arsenal in the United States. Most of that buildup of our atomic weapons was during the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, Hanford shut down and became a cleanup project. Well, the big problem out at Hanford is when they were making all this atomic fuel, they had to put the byproduct somewhere. So to get plutonium, they had to go through this nuclear reactors. Plutonium is a byproduct of the nuclear reaction, of the fission reaction. But there's also a ton of other waste that comes along with that. So over the course of those 40 years of when it was in production, there was literally billions of gallons of chemical waste that was produced and millions of gallons of high-level radioactive waste. Today, there are 56 million gallons of highly radioactive waste that's sitting in these big underground tanks, 177 of these huge underground tanks. And some of that waste is just bubbling and it's sitting there. Those tanks were made really only the last a few decades. I mean, we're going on 80 years now. And 60 years now. So, they're way past their lifespan. We've had leaks, we've had accidents, we've had cover-ups. And the whistleblowers I've talked to are really concerned about some of the accidents and things that potentially could happen out there. And so today, part of that cleanup process is trying to deal with all this waste. So the other big problem that we're facing now is that you have private contractors that are in charge of this cleanup, in particular, a corporation called Bechtel, which is a private corporation. They're in charge of building this huge facility that is to turn this waste into glass. And the idea being, it's called vitrification. And the idea being that if you turn all this stuff into glass, you can store it permanently and safely. It's still radioactive, but it's not as virulent as it is right now. And I think a lot of us, myself included, supports this effort. But the problem is there isn't a lot of oversight. There's not a lot of technical support on the government side. The Department of Energy is in charge of the cleanup. And what a lot of whistleblowers have told me and others is that, the Department of Energy is just not tasked, doesn't have enough staff, doesn't have enough money to oversee how massive this project is. And to put it in perspective, it's the most expensive environmental cleanup in world history. We're looking at $677 billion price tag right now. And it's been, 10 years ago, it was 100 billion. I mean, it just is going up exponentially. My guess is by the end of this decade, it'll be well over $1 trillion. And we're paying for it. The taxpayers are paying for it. So there's very little accountability. So that's kind of the whole, the whole deal in a Cliff Note version. But some of the dangers that it poses right now are very, very dire. So you have 2 tanks right now out there that they're admitting are leaking. That leaking waste is making its way into the groundwater supply. That groundwater supply feeds the Columbia River, which is about 300 miles upstream from Portland, Oregon. It also acts as an irrigation waters for lots of Northwest farmers. There's also commercial fisheries on the Columbia River. So they've had a lot of radioactive materials in the river when it was operating, but as these tanks continue to leak, we're going to continue to see those materials make their way into the river. So that's one major problem. And the other big problem is these tanks are producing, some of them are producing hydrogen. So hydrogen is highly flammable and can cause radioactive, explosion if it were to be ignited. So they have to consistently monitor these things and let that hydrogen and that buildup be released from these tanks so that there isn't an explosion. Because if there is an explosion, you're going to see radioactive material. It will be a nuclear explosion that will spread across the country and will absolutely destroy the surrounding communities around Hanford and a lot of those downwind from there. And this isn't without precedent. We had an accident at a sister facility of Hanford out in the former Soviet Union in 1957, known as Mayak. And Mayak was just like Hanford. It produced plutonium for the Soviets' atomic arsenal. And they had an accident at one of their storage facilities there that produced a huge, huge explosion. It was covered up by the government, of course, because this was a covert, military operation. Whole villages were destroyed. And to this day, it's a radioactive wasteland. So, there's a lot of worry that something like that could happen at Hanford. And I cover that in pretty great detail in the book.
I'm pretty well versed on what's going on, and how come an average person like me who tries to keep up with news and what I hear, how come I didn't know about this?
I think there's a lot of reasons why Hanford isn't making headlines. I mean, in my view, I would think that at least the fact that there's 2 highly radioactive waste tanks that are leaking right now in this country should be front page news, right?
Right.
I mean, we all remember probably when the BP oil spill was happening in the Gulf, and we had that 24-hour live cam of the spewing oil from the floor of the Gulf, and everybody was concerned and worried and flabbergasted. And I don't see why we shouldn't be just as flabbergasted about what's happening at Hanford right now. I mean, I think it's equally, if not more, dangerous in some ways. So I think some of that is that there isn't a live cam, right? It's not something that we can watch happen. I think that it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. Hanford is in a pretty rural area. It's not next to an urban center. It's not, it also was cloaked in secrecy for so long because Hanford was a covert military operation.
Mhm.
Even people that worked at Hanford, you might live next door to them in a town, Richland, which is adjacent to Hanford, which is where all the workers lived and live today. the cleanup workers and engineers and scientists. But you might not even know what your neighbor does because your job was different than theirs, and it didn't cross over because it was so secretive. So that secrecy, I think, has transcended the end of the Cold War, and it still very much engulfs the operation. And then on top of that, it's just enormously complex. Nuclear technology in general is very, very complex. And what was happening out at Hanford was very complex. The cleanup is very complex.
Mhm.
So it takes a lot of, expertise to kind of unravel all of this. And I'm by no means an expert. I'm just a journalist. But it's taken me a long time to even kind of get the basics down of what's going on out there. And in order, in a way that I can actually relay it and talk about it publicly. So I think the scrutiny isn't there because the journalists aren't there. And then on top of that, the Department of Energy just doesn't invite scrutiny. And of course, the contractors don't want public oversight as well. So I think all of this kind of together has made Hanford a sort of a secret disaster in waiting.
You know the area in which I live in. There was a site called NL Industries,
Mm-hmm.
Colony, and a lot of the people that lived near the site came down with all kinds of cancers. So when you talk about the site in your book,
Mm-hmm.
wasn't there a proliferation of cancer and didn't the people realize that?
Absolutely. So the government hasn't done a lot of these longitudinal studies to look at the long-term impacts of radioactive exposures out there. And that's on purpose, right? But anecdotally, observationally, qualitatively, we've seen massive increases in cancer rates among the Yakima Nation, which is a native nation that makes up a number of tribes that's also very close to Hanford. There's farmers in and around the area that have talked about the high rates of thyroid cancers. So we do have, ample evidence that the rates are higher in those areas. But, when it comes down to the scientific published studies, there hasn't been a lot of information about it. And a lot of that's because a lot of this stuff happened years ago. Intentional releases of radioactivity has happened at Hanford. It happened in something called the Green Run, where they released iodine-131 to see how it would spread across the region and how it, how their equipment was testing it. There's a lot of theories about what they were actually up to, what the government was up to, but ultimately they poisoned unwitting civilians, and they didn't really do long-term studies about what those impacts were. And this happened in the 50s. So some of this stuff is hard to track now because it happened a long time ago. But if you talk to anybody that's outside of Hanford, that's not involved in Hanford, that doesn't have a stake in Hanford, they'll tell you that they've seen higher rates than their neighbors, or higher rates than other parts of the state. And they blame Hanford, there's no doubt. But what we do know is the government was monitoring radioactive levels in the Columbia River. They found high levels in the fish, way higher than would have been normal. They found radioactive fish at the mouth of the Columbia River. So they knew, that radioactive materials were spreading far and wide in that region. And as we know, with depleted uranium, like what you're talking about in the storage facility outside of Albany, that this stuff lingers for a really, really, really long time. It doesn't just go away, which, I think is the lesson we should take away from Hanford, is that this stuff sticks around. Plutonium is radioactive for 250,000 years. That's a really long time, right? Humans have only been roaming outside of Africa for 60,000 years. So put that in perspective.
Right.
A lot, it's a huge problem, which is why I believe that we need to have more scrutiny and more accountability, because we need to get this place at least in a state where it's safe. I don't know if it can ever be truly remediated, but I do think that we could get it so that it's not a ticking time bomb.
Now, when I had seen you in Troy, you mentioned the site itself, and you said that there's an indigenous population around there. And I asked you if it was put there by design. What 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 do you say about that?
Sure. Well, it absolutely was put there by design. The government, as you know, has long deemed Native Americans as expendable. And the site along the Columbia River was long, dominated by Western expansionism and manifest destiny.
Hmm.
So this was just the next domino in that horrible chain of events that have happened in American history. And on top of the native population that was exposed out there and removed from their native lands to build this beast called Hanford, you also had a lot of peasant farmers out there that worked the lands alongside Native Americans, and of course they were settlers. They were sort of the first wave of Western expansion, but they were also removed from these lands, and they were also relocated. So it was picked. The site was picked because those groups of people were easily removed. That's one reason why. Another reason was that the site is, like I mentioned, adjacent to the Columbia River. So you need cold, cool waters to cool down reactors, atomic reactors. So in the case of Hanford, there were 9 reactors. So they needed that constant cool water to cool them down. It had constant electricity because there's a number of dams along the Columbia River. You need electricity to keep things cool and the pumps running. So there was a number of reasons why they chose Hanford, and one of them was because they weren't going to get a lot of pushbacks from locals. Indigenous people were easily removed, and there's obviously racist undertones of why they did that, and classist undertones as well. And they also just needed that much land. There was, they needed a lot of land for this. They needed water. So it was in the minds of the Manhattan Project officials that it was a perfect spot for this kind of operation.
I'm sure it polluted the water, which caused a lot of people to become sick, right?
Yes, it's hard to say, how many people it ultimately impacted in that way. So from a journalistic standpoint, I don't know how many people were ultimately impacted, but I can say that there's a number of people who believe their families were impacted. And the Yakima Nation, one elder who I write about, which was a steadfast advocate, his name was Russell Jim, and he fought hard for the Yakima Nation and so that they would have a seat at the table, so that no major decisions were made out there without a seat at the table for Native tribes. He talked about how there was really, really high rates of thyroid cancers among his people, how there was high rates of rheumatoid arthritis among young men and women on the reservation, which is odd, right? That 30-year-olds were coming down with rheumatoid arthritis, and they blamed their proximity to Hanford. And the government hasn't really looked into this. It costs a lot of money to do these big studies, and there's reasons why they don't want them done, right? So I would say that it's absolutely impacted thousands and thousands of people. There's no question in my mind about that, even though there haven't been a bunch of scientifically published reports on it. Anybody that's lived in and around the facility has probably been exposed, especially during its operation when it was up and running and producing plutonium, because it was off-putting radioactive materials almost 24 hours a day. I mean, it was like a conveyor belt of plutonium. So yeah, I think it caused a lot of sickness and a lot of death over time. And just to remind your listeners, radioactive, you can have a major exposure of radioactivity, and you could die. You could be around Chernobyl when it was the meltdown, right? And you were dead in a couple of weeks if you were part of that cleanup crew, or you're exposed in some way. Or more likely, you're around the facility, and over time, over decades, you're exposed to radioactive materials through the food that you eat that's grown on the grounds where there's radioactive material. You could have been exposed when the event happened, and it bioaccumulates. It builds up in your bones and in your muscles, and then over time develops into cancers. So it's kind of like smoking a cigarette. You can smoke one cigarette, you're not going to get cancer, but if you smoke consistently for years and years and years, your
Right.
likelihood of having heart or lung problems goes up, and that's the same with exposure to radioactive materials. So again, but that's really hard stuff to quantify. It's hard stuff. It takes a long time to look at these numbers and to look at people. And there's reasons why the government doesn't really want to do that.
So is there any kind of a solution to this problem that you're aware of?
I think there are scientific and engineering solutions that will really help alleviate the mess out there. My thinking is that the real problem lies in the approach to the cleanup, that it's reliant on private contractors, that the government is understaffed and underfunded. And I believe that if we had more accountability, more public oversight, that things might get done right. I mean, I'm not opposed, and many people that want to see this place cleaned up, at least to a point of safety, aren't afraid to spend $1 trillion if that's what it takes to get it done. But we want that money spent to get it done right. One thing I would say is, they were trying to make this stuff into glass since the early 90s, and they haven't done it yet. They've made very, very little progress in getting this done, virtually no progress whatsoever, except they've spent a lot of money. So I think if the money's being spent and there's accountability and the job's getting done, great. But if the money's getting spent and the job's not getting done, then there's a problem. And I think there's a problem. And I would like to see congressional hearings. I'd like to see these Bechtel executives pulled in front of Congress and questioned. I would like to see the Department of Energy held accountable as well. And then I'd want to question why we're not scrutinizing this more. I think that the budget, this gets buried into the Department of Energy budget, and a lot of people in Congress don't even know what they're voting on. They don't even know about Hanford. Barack Obama, when he was running for Senate of Illinois, I guess that would have been what? How long ago was that? 2006 or something? He was asked if he had ever heard of Hanford, and he didn't even know what Hanford was. And Obama's not a stupid person. So there's a lot of lack of knowledge about what Hanford is, even among those that are supporting its budgets. So I think even educating Congress is a first step, and holding those hearings is a second step.
Educating Congress is one thing. The other more important thing is educating the American people as to what's going on. I mean, you're doing a video with me. I don't see MSNBC knocking down your door to get you on TV or,
No.
any of the other cable networks. How do you get this message out besides going to different places and doing videos like this?
I wish I had a good crisp answer for you. I just do what I can do. And one thing I'll say is, I'm not the only one out here trying to raise awareness. There are a number of groups that are doing really, really great work on Hanford. One's Hanford Challenge. They're located in Seattle. Another one is the Columbia River Keeper. They're not far downriver. They're in Hood River, Oregon. And you also have the Yakima Nation, which is actively involved. So there's a lot of people that are working on this issue. Nationally, it's not getting the attention it deserves. And I can hopefully play a very small role in that, and just try to get this book in as many hands as possible and people talking about this problem.
And the name of the book is?
Atomic Days, The Untold Story of the Most Toxic Place in America.
And how can people obtain it?
They can go to any bookstore, should have it, and it was published by Haymarket Books. And you can go to Haymarket Books, their website, and find it and order it. I think at a nice discount from them. So.
And you also write for Counterpunch, right?
I do. Yep, and I'm the managing editor of Counterpunch. That's my day job.
And basically, what kind of stuff do you write? Do you write more than environmental stuff?
Environmental stuff is sort of my wheelhouse, but I also like to write about the connection between, the environment and militarism, and also I like to write about sort of the impacts of energy, green energy even, and with this book, obviously, I've written a lot about atomic energy and the pitfalls of that and why it must be opposed.
Okay, so check out Joshua Frank on Counterpunch. I'm Cynthia Pooler, and I've been speaking to Joshua Frank. So if you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And thanks, Josh. It was great seeing you in Albany and great seeing on the screen here. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a great day.